Hello and welcome to the fourth SPSS video tutorial in this series. In this video I'm going to show you how to create variables and enter data in the data editor in SPSS. The first variable we'll create will just provide an individual identification number for each case. We'll call this variable ID number. The first column in the variable view is called name. We type the name of our variable in here. We'll type ID number in the first row of the name column and then press enter. You'll see that SPSS automatically fills in most of the rest of the columns. We'll come back to these different columns later, but it's important to note something about variable names in SPSS first. SPSS is quite fussy about variable names. It doesn't allow you to have spaces and some other characters. So select the cell in which you typed ID number and try to type in the same two words with a space between ID and number. After you press enter, you'll see that a dialog appears telling you that the variable name contains an illegal character. You can press OK. Now try to do this again, but instead of the space, have an underscore between ID and number. You'll see that SPSS allows this, but not spaces. So we'll keep this as our variable name. It's best to have quite short variable names so you can see them easily in the data view. You can provide more information in the label column, but don't make these too long either, as they appear in the outputs, which we'll look at later, and can make the results look quite messy and hard to interpret. You are allowed to have any characters you want in the label, however, including spaces. You'll see that as well as name and label, there are also other different column headings. The only ones that you need to worry about are values and missing, which we will look at later. For the moment, we've done everything we need to do with this variable, so click on the Data View tab again. The only change you should notice to the data view is that instead of the heading of the first column saying var, it now says ID number. There are no data in the rest of the spreadsheet because we haven't entered any yet. All we want to do with our ID number variable is to create a different ID number for each of the cases for which we have data. So if you had 200 cases, you'd need 200 different ID numbers. The easiest way to do this is to assign the first case the number 1, the second case the number 2, and so on, all the way up to 200. With a small amount of data, it's easiest to do this manually. If you've got questionnaire data, for example, you would put an ID number in when you entered the data from each questionnaire. So, if you select the first empty cell under the ID number column, it should turn yellow. Press 1 on the keyboard and then enter. Two things should happen. The yellow highlight should move down one cell and the number 1.00 will appear in the original cell. You'll notice that it has a decimal place and 2 zeros when you only entered the number 1. This is one of SPSS's default settings which you have to look out for. Having the decimal places doesn't really matter, but if it bothers, you can click on the Variable View tab and find the decimals column, which is the fourth column on the left. If you click on the cell with the number 2 in it, you can replace it with 0. You can either do this by entering 0, or you can adjust the number with the arrows at the side. If you click back on the Data View tab, you'll now notice that your ID number, case 1, just has a number 1 in it. And if you enter a 2 for the second case, it will just have a 2 in it without the decimal places. Now you can generate a large number of ID numbers automatically using a script, but I'm not going to show you how to do that, and you can Google it if you want. For the moment, let's just add cases up to 10. If you are going to do this with your own data, you'll need to remember to label each questionnaire, for example, with the number you've assigned to it as an ID, so that if there are any problems or issues that arise, you can go back and check what you've entered in your data editor in SPSS with the data that are on your questionnaire or observations or whatever you're entering the data for. Now that you have identifying numbers for each case, you'll want to enter the information you collected from your respondents. Let's start by creating a variable for age. Click on the Variable View tab. It should turn yellow. Now click on the first cell in the second row under the Name heading. Type in age and press Enter. You'll notice that, like before, SPSS automatically fills in some of the other cells. Next, click on the cell in the second row under the Label column. In here, we'll type in age in years, as for most data on adults and young people would only record age to the nearest year. If we were looking at very young children or babies, we may use days, weeks, or months. If you like, you can adjust the value in decimals column to 0, as for most research, we wouldn't be recording fractions of a year. If you click back to the data view, you can now enter some ages. These would be taken from your questionnaire or other data collection instrument, but for now just enter and copy the values that I put in. Age is straightforward to enter because it's a continuous variable. But we're now going to enter some data for sex, which is a bit more difficult because it is a categorical variable. Click on the Variable View tab and create a third variable name called sex. You should know where to put the name by now. You don't really need to put a different label, but it's useful to have some kind of label in the output, so you can just put sex in the label box. You definitely won't need decimal points for this variable, so adjust the value in the decimal column so that it reads 0. Now click on Data View to get back to the data. Imagine that the first respondent was male and type male into the first cell under the sex column, and then press Enter. As you can see, SPSS won't let you put text in the cell, as its default setting, another one of those, is for numeric data. You can change the settings to allow SPSS to accept text, but this isn't really required and sometimes isn't very useful. So what we will do instead is decide to label each category in the variable sex with a number. So click back to the variable view and we can see how this is done. You'll notice that there is a column called values. At the moment, all of the cells under this column say none. We don't need any values for our ID numbers. Each number is a way of identifying each case. And we don't need labels for our data on age either, as 24 means 24 years old. It's relatively self-explanatory. But we're going to use numbers as labels for male and female, and we're going to have to decide which numbers to use and which relate to each category. If you have only two categories, for example male and female, it's best to use 1 and 0. What numbers you use won't matter for basic analyses, but this is a good habit to get into because you need to label categories in this way when you go on to do more advanced analysis. So let's decide that female will be labeled 1 and male will be labeled 0. If we click on the cell for sex in the values column, a small square appears on the right hand side of the cell. Clicking on this cell generates a dialog box. Click in the value box and type in 1. Next, click in the label box and type in female. Click the Add button. This is very important as the labels won't be saved if you don't do this. Repeat this procedure but with 0 as the value and male as the label. Then click OK. You've now created the labels. Click back to data view. You can now add in ones and noughts, copying the pattern that I have used, and enter in values for males and females in the data editor. You've just created a categorical variable, sex, with two categories, male and female. But what if you wanted to create a categorical variable with more than two categories, like social class, or ethnicity, or type of school attended, or type of criminal offence committed? Well, you just need to do the same thing, but create more labels. You'll need to use more numbers than 1 and 0, but for most basic analyses that won't matter. So let's create a variable for social class to demonstrate how this works. We'll use the simplest version of the NSSEC, which has 3 categories for occupations and 1 for long-term unemployment. Click back to the variable view. Put class in the name column for your 4th variable. We don't need any decimal places, so let's get rid of those. And let's put NSSEC in the label column to remind us the classification that we're using. Now we have to decide on the values we're going to use to label each class. When we have more than 2 categories, it doesn't matter what numbers you use as long as you know what they mean. You don't have to label them, but this helps you remember which numbers relate to which classes. As the NSSEC already uses numbers, we can use these. Click on the values cell for the class variable and then click on the little square. Put 1 in the value box. The NSSEC labels managerial and professional occupations as 1, so we'll just shorten this to managerial or manager and put this as our label. Remember to press add and next put in a number 2. The next NSSEC category is intermediate occupations. So we can put intermediate as the label and again press add. The third NSSEC category is routine and manual occupations. So let's enter a 3 and label it as manual and again press add. The fourth NSSEC category, long-term unemployed, doesn't have a number. Now we know what label we can put it. The official title is never worked or long-term unemployed, but we can just shorten this to unemployed. So let's put that in the label. But what value do we give it? We could label this as 0, but I'm going to suggest that it makes more sense to label it as 4. This is because, although there's debate as to what extent class categories are ordered, there seems to be some kind of order in the NSSEC categories, and being unemployed seems less desirable in many ways than being in many of the other categories. So if managerial jobs are 1, I'm suggesting we add 4 for unemployed, and it goes right to the bottom of the scale. So we'll click add again and then press OK. Now that you've created your class variable, we can click onto data view and see that we have a column for class now in this view. We can enter the numbers in here, each of them corresponding to a different class. So for example, if case number 1 was managerial, we'd put in 1. If case number 2 was manual, we'd put in number 3. If case number 3 was unemployed, we'd put in 4. And if case number 4 was intermediate, we'd put in 2, and so on. But if we click back to variable view, there's one more column that we need to concern ourselves with, and this is the missing column. Now it's often the case that not all data are available for each respondent. Someone completing a questionnaire, for example, might miss a question by mistake or because they didn't want to disclose certain information. There's a lot you can do when designing your research to minimize item non-response, as it's called, but it's usually the case that you end up with some missing responses. The missing column is where you keep track of missing responses. It would be possible in this data, for example, that some of the responses for age were missing. If this was true, we would need to code the missing data by assigning a value to it. This is the value we'd put in our data set whenever we came across a missing age. It's better to assign a value for missing data, as if you leave a cell empty, you won't know if you've done so by mistake or there's genuinely a missing value. We have to choose a value for missing data that won't actually occur in our real data, as we can't have the same value coded as missing and as a legitimate entry. Minus numbers are often quite useful for this, as for many variables they wouldn't be a possible value. I use minus 99 quite a lot. You couldn't have an age of minus 99, so it would work for this variable. So for example, in age, we could have a discrete missing value of minus 99. Be careful though, if you're collecting financial data, minus 99 could be a value that could legitimately arise in the data. So in those cases, you'd have to find a more suitable missing value to use. Minus 99 would actually work for all of the variables we've got. As for sex, we've only got 1 or 0 as labels. Minus 99 isn't one of those, so we could put it in there. And as for class, we've got the values 1 to 4, so minus 99 would work there. It's good to have as fewer different numbers of labels for missing values as possible, just to keep things simple and so that you know where everything is. So here we have minus 99 for all of our variables. For ID number, because we assign the ID, there wouldn't be missing data. So with this tutorial, you've seen how to create different variables, and you've also seen what data looks like for a particular case or for a particular variable. Now that we've covered entering data and you know your way around the SPSS interface, we can look at some of the ways SPSS can help you analyze your data. That's what we're going to be covering in the rest of these videos.